Story 1. Dreams and Nightmares. My dreams and nightmares as a child were haunted by a story I read in a book my parents bought for me. It was a book of true ghost stories, which I loved when I was a little kid. It remains the most disturbing and creepy true ghost story I've ever come across. I can't remember all the details, but I will try to recount as much of the story as I'm able to recall. The book claimed that it was a true story, but try as I might, I've never been able to find out more information about it. Years ago, in a small town, somewhere in the United States, a married couple and their young daughter moved into an old house. One night, the daughter was awakened by a strange smell in her bedroom. At first, she wasn't sure if she was still dreaming. She could hardly breathe and the air was thick with smoke. As she blinked her eyes and looked around, she found that her bedroom looked different. The wallpaper was old and peeling off the walls. The carpet was threadbare and worn away in places. The furniture in her room seemed to be old-fashioned and there were cobwebs and mold all over everything. Frightened, she jumped out of bed and tried to make her way down the hall to her parents' room. Minutes later, the family who lived next door heard screams outside their house and a rapping on their front door. When they opened the door, they found the little girl standing there. She was crying and babbling incoherently, and kept pointing to her own house. When they looked across the garden wall, they saw that her house was on fire. They immediately called the fire brigade, who arrived minutes later and put out the fire. Sadly, most of the house was burned beyond repair and in the rubble, they found the charred bodies of the little girl's parents. It appeared that they had been burned alive while they lay in bed. When police questioned the little girl, she told them a shocking and unbelievable story. When she had woken up during the night, she went to her parents' room and opened the door. She had been confronted by a horrifying scene. Her parents lay dead in bed and there were two young black boys standing over them. One of the boys was holding a bloody scissors. The girl said she began screaming and fled to the neighbor's house. The police didn't believe her story at first, and assumed she must have been having nightmares. But when they researched the history of the house, they found that it had originally been a reform school for young black boys. The boys were treated horribly by the people who ran the reform school and it had eventually been closed down and converted into a residential property. Nobody could ever convince the little girl that what she had seen was just a dream. This is the story I read in that book years ago and, of all the true ghost stories I've ever read, this one scared me the most. It freaked me out to the point that I had to throw away the book because I kept having nightmares. LOL. So if anyone recognizes this story, please leave a comment and tell me where it happened so I can research the story further and determine whether or not it is actually true. Story 2. Demon of Detroit. The Demon of Detroit is a true scary story about the Cole Adams house in Detroit, Michigan, which was said to be haunted by a horrible thing of unspeakable terror. It all started in the early 1960s, when Mr. and Mrs. Adams moved into the house in Detroit, Michigan. They had 5 small children and a pet dog. Almost as soon as they moved in, the family seemed to sense that there was something wrong with the back bedroom. All of the children avoided it and even the dog refused to go inside. It was a tiny room with just enough space for a bed and a built-in closet in the corner. Mr. Adams worked the night shift at the Cadillac assembly plant, so when he came home in the morning, he would sleep in the back bedroom. It was far enough away from the rest of the house that he thought no one would disturb him. However, sleeping in the bedroom always gave him a strange and uneasy feeling. Almost immediately, he began to experience horrible nightmares. They were so vivid and real that he would wake up screaming and shaking with fear. In one of the ghastly nightmares, he dreamed that he opened the closet door and the blood-soaked and mutilated body of a woman fell out. As the days went by, the dreams became worse and worse. He lost so much sleep and he was so exhausted that he ended up moving back to the master bedroom with his wife. The nightmares suddenly stopped. When his mother came to visit the family, they let her sleep in the back bedroom. The next morning, she said she didn't get a wink of sleep. Her face was pale and her whole body was shaking. She claimed she had heard terrible sounds in the room that went on all night long, as if someone was trying to break in. She refused to sleep in the bedroom again and decided to cut her stay short and go home. After that, Mr. and Mrs. Adams began to realize that something dark and loathsome was lurking in the back bedroom. Then, an old friend of the family came to town and they gave him the room for the night. They didn't mention a thing to him about their own unpleasant experiences in the room. Shortly after midnight, the man was lying in bed when he was awakened by the feeling of someone turning him over. He opened his eyes and saw someone standing outside the bedroom door. It was a woman with long hair, but she had her back to him. She was wearing a short fur coat and a blue dress. He got up and started walking towards her, but all of a sudden, every light in the house went off. He was stumbling around in the darkness and when the lights came back on again, he found himself in the kitchen. Mrs. Adams was there, washing her hair in the kitchen sink. All of a sudden, they heard a terrible, unearthly wailing sound that left both of them speechless with fright and a sickening smell filled the room. Then, the heavy trap door in the kitchen floor that led to the dirt basement started opening and slamming back down. Terrified, they called the police. Within minutes, a few officers were searching the house from top to bottom, but they didn't find anything. The next morning, when Mr. Adams got home from the plant, his wife and friend were waiting for him. As calmly as they could, they told him what they had experienced during the night. He didn't believe them. That evening, he decided to sleep in the back bedroom. He was just about to drift off when he heard someone moving in the room. He thought it was his wife, but when he called her name, there was no answer. He turned over to look and saw a hideous face, just inches from him. It was the most horrible thing he had ever seen. The eyes stared past him and the mouth moved to talk, but all that came out was a hissing sound and a terrible stench. Mr. Adams came running out of the back bedroom, his eyes wide and screaming with terror. He was ripping handfuls of hair from his head as he ran. His friend tried to grab him and hold him down, but Mr. Adams went berserk, kicking and fighting. Finally his wife and his friend managed to throw a blanket over him and wrestle him to the floor. The house was filled with the same nauseating stench they had smelled the night before. An hour later, he had calmed down enough to tell his family about the ghastly and indescribable face he had seen. The husband and wife grabbed their sleeping children from their beds and fled into the night. The next morning, they all moved in with Mrs. Adams' parents in a different part of Detroit. The Adams family had to admit defeat and they left the house and the back bedroom to the horrific entity that was lurking in it. The Demon of Detroit. Story 3. Island of the Dolls. The Island of the Dolls is a true ghost story about a scary place in Mexico that is said to be haunted by the ghost of a young girl. It is also known as Isla de las Muñeces. The Island of the Dolls is located just south of Mexico City, between the canals of Xochimilco. It is famous as being one of the scariest places in the world. The island is covered with the severed heads and dismembered bodies of creepy old dolls. They hang from the branches of trees, their glass eyes staring at anyone who passes by. At night, things become even more disturbing. Some people claim the dolls move their heads and arms and open their eyes. Others say that they have heard the dolls whispering to each other in the darkness. They say that, years ago, a man named Don Julian Santana lived alone on the island. One day, he found the dead body of a young girl floating face down in the canal. She had drowned. He believed that her ghost haunted the island. The man collected dolls and hung them from the trees to appease the dead girl's restless spirit. He thought this would make the little girl happy and keep evil spirits at bay. As time went by, he came to believe that the dolls were possessed by the spirits of the dead. The story took an even more sinister turn in 2001 when Don Julian was found dead under mysterious circumstances. He drowned in the canal at exactly the same spot where he found the little girl years before. Some people say that the old man was murdered by his dolls. Today, the island of the dolls is a tourist destination. People come from all over the world to see the creepy and bizarre decorations. Story 4. Meat Cleaver. The Meat Cleaver is a scary true ghost story about the bloody ghost of a young Chinese man who haunts the streets of Victoria in British Columbia, Canada. The year was 1889, and in the city of Victoria, Canada, there was a busy and overcrowded area known as Chinatown. In this area, there lived a young Chinese man named Chan Oh-han. He was 17 years old and he earned a meager living cleaning rooms and making beds in the American Hotel. Nearby, in a narrow little street called Fan Tan Alley, there lived a beautiful young Chinese girl by the name of Yao. She was very poor and had to support herself by working in a house of ill repute. The first time Chen laid eyes on her, he immediately fell in love with her. The young man came by many times to talk to her as she sat at her window in the evening. One day, he worked up the courage to propose to her. She thought he was joking and laughed at him. When she realized he really did want to marry her, she told him she couldn't leave her employer. She said her boss was a mean and violent man. If she left, he would hunt her down and kill her. Chan was determined and came back the next day with a vial of poison. He passed it to her through the window and told her to use it to kill her boss. "Pour it on his food," said Chan, "kill him and his wife. Then, we can be together." The girl was shocked at this, and when she realized he was serious, she didn't want anything to do with him. After all, he was penniless. What kind of husband would he make? What kind of life could they have together? Also, she knew what the penalty for murder was. She told him to go away and never come back. She turned him down so brutally that the young man was humiliated. As he walked through the streets, he felt like everyone was laughing at him. For a while, he did stay away, but a few days later, he came back and he had a friend with him. Chan and his friend crept around the building, keeping to the shadows, so that Yao couldn't see them. The friend reached in the window and grabbed Yao by hair. He pulled the poor girl halfway out and held her there. She was shouting and struggling. She didn't know what was going on. That's when she saw Chan come walking up. She watched in horror as he reached into his jacket and took out huge meat cleaver. Yao let out a high-pitched scream as he raised the meat cleaver in the air and brought it crashing down with all his might. In one fell swoop, it sliced straight through her neck and her head rolled along the cobblestones. It was pandemonium. There was blood everywhere. Chan fled, running for all he was worth through the maze of backstreets and narrow alleys. People saw him come rushing towards them. He was covered in blood and holding the meat cleaver over his head. They dodged out of his way, convinced he was an escaped lunatic. The police offered a reward for his capture and put up posters all over Chinatown. Reward $150 for information leading to the arrest of a young man wanted for murder in Chinatown. Acting on a tip-off, the police searched the American Hotel and found Chan in the basement, hiding in the coal bin. He was arrested and thrown in jail. Just 2 days later, the young man took his shirt, wrapped it around his neck and hanged himself in his cell. They say his ghost still runs down the back streets and alleyways of Chinatown at night. People hear footsteps approaching. Then, suddenly, a young Chinese man emerges from the shadows. He comes right at them, covered in blood and wielding a butcher's meat cleaver. He pushes them out of the way and then disappears into the night. Many people in Victoria claim they have encountered this terrifying ghostly apparition, and he is most frequently seen in Fantan Alley. Story 5. Handshake. The Handshake is a true ghost story about a man who dumped his fiancée before the wedding. It is also known as the cold hand, or the ice-cold handshake. George Deans. In an old forgotten cemetery, just north of Goldsboro, North Carolina, there is a headstone that is cracked in half and held together by a pair of rusty brackets. Engraved at the top, there is the strangely haunting image of a handshake. The name on the grave is George Deans, and this is his story. Back in 1856, there was a 17-year-old girl named Rachel Vinson who thought she had found the man of her dreams. He was 8 years older than her, and his name was George Deans. Rachel dreamed about the beautiful wedding they would have. She was head over heels in love, but unfortunately George didn't feel the same way about her. He had a wandering eye, and soon he was cheating on her with a number of other girls. When she found out that he was being unfaithful, Rachel was devastated. However, she didn't want to lose him, so she told him how much she loved him and said that she would still marry him if he stopped seeing other girls. George wasn't a very sensitive, and he bluntly dumped her. Rachel's heart was broken, and she felt like she could never love again. She fell into a deep, dark spiral of sadness and depression. Within weeks, her uncontrollable grief made her sick. She came down with a fever, and her body grew weaker and weaker. She had lost the will to live. One day, she called George to her bedside and asked him to lean in close. Then she whispered in his ear. "I realize I can never have you in this world," she said, "but I shall claim you in the next." The next day, Rachel died. She was buried in the little graveyard, and George tried to put her out of his thoughts and go on about his life. Almost a year later, George Deans was wandering home from a Christmas party, tipsy with drink. His route took him past the graveyard where Rachel was buried. As he walked, he saw a strange fog-like mist rising out of the cemetery. It came floating towards him over the headstones and gradually formed into the ghostly figure of a woman. George started shaking and staggered backward as he recognized Rachel's face. He was so frightened that he was unable to run as the ghostly apparition came closer and closer. Suddenly, it reached out and grabbed his hand. Its touch was icy cold. Colder than death. Then, in an instant, the apparition vanished. George was found wandering aimlessly down the road. He seemed to be in a daze, and his right hand hung limp by his side. It was frozen solid. From then on, he suffered from excruciating pain in the hand the ghost had touched. Within days, his hand began to wither and shrivel up. Eventually, it dangled uselessly at his side. George Deans never married and spent the rest of his life alone. When he died, he was buried in the same cemetery as Rachel Vinson. In his will, he had left instructions for that ghostly image to be chiseled on the tombstone above his name. Two hands eternally clasped in an ice-cold handshake.